So, Dr. Williams, could you talk to us a little bit about what's different about using buprenorphine?
So buprenorphine was a breakthrough, and there's some history here in terms of treating opioid use disorders. About 100 years ago, in the 1920s or so, physicians were being incarcerated for prescribing opioids to their patients who were addicted to opium. So there's been a tension between physicians, between the practice of medicine and law enforcement officials who were concerned about the misuse of prescription medications for maintaining people, if anything, worsening their drug addictions. Our thinking has changed dramatically because of all of the evidence that's come out over the last few decades in particular. And now we have medications like methadone and Suboxone that are life-saving if people take them every day as they're prescribed. So Data 2000 was an act that was passed around 2000 in anticipation of buprenorphine coming to market, and it did in 2002. It was FDA approved for the treatment of patients with opioid use disorders. Buprenorphine has a novel mechanism of action. It isn't what's considered a full agonist or a full activator at the opioid receptors in the brain. It's more like a partial activator. It has some properties that activate the receptor. It also has some properties that shut down the activity of the receptor. Unfortunately, the part that's blocked by buprenorphine is the part that leads to overdose, that leads to the suppression of the respiratory drive in the brain. And for that reason, buprenorphine is a Schedule III substance under the Controlled Substances Act. Because there's a ceiling effect on the risk of overdose death with buprenorphine, it's a Schedule III substance under the Controlled Substances Act. So methadone is Schedule II. Other opioids tend to be Schedule II, more or less. But buprenorphine is Schedule III, which indicates that there's less risk of abuse, less risk of danger with this medication. And because of that protection from overdose, buprenorphine, through the Data 2000 Act, is allowed to be prescribed in the outpatient setting. So sometimes you see this term OBOT, which refers to the outpatient-based opioid treatment for patients. Because again, 100 years ago, physicians couldn't write prescriptions from their office to help patients with opioid use disorders. And now they can for the last 14 years or so because of the Data 2000 Act and buprenorphine being FDA approved in 2002. Now the downside to this, or what some people are criticizing our current system for, is that physicians need special credentialing called an X waiver to be allowed to prescribe buprenorphine. There are still risks, and we know from early studies in France, for instance, that patients who inject buprenorphine, especially if they inject it in combination with benzodiazepines, that there can be fatalities from it. Fortunately, we don't see those trends in the United States. But because of the potential risk for harm to patients, even though it's much less than with methadone or other opioids, there are restrictions on who can prescribe it. So there's an 8-hour course that's required before physicians can prescribe it.